Why hello you love little peppercorns, my name's Noa Lee, god of game criticism and lord of excellent taste, and welcome to the Summer Catch-Up, a series of more laid-back videos where I critique a few of the games from earlier this year that I didn't have a chance to make a full video out of, while also taking some time off to play Shadow of the Erdtree, recharge my batteries for the second half of the year. That's exactly what I meant. Have you ever played a game that does nothing new, doesn't push the boundaries of video game design, and, mechanically speaking, is identical to at least 100 other games you've already played, yet somehow it manages to captivate you in a way that even the most highly polished experimental indie gems rarely do? Well, that was my experience with Josef Felvidek's Felvidek, an RPG Maker title set in a fictionalized version of 15th century Slovakia that follows a series of characters as they uncover and track down the source of a cult who's using the flaming head of an ancient Zoroastrian god of destruction to roast coffee beans, which, once consumed, cause all those who partake to be transformed into twisted monstrosities, all the while arguing about various sects of Abrahamic religions, adultery, and ale. And if that isn't one hell of a unique setup and conflict, I don't know what is. Fuck yeah. You play as Pavel, an alcoholic knight serving a feudal lord during a time of tension and skirmishes with invading Hussites and whispers of intervention and espionage from the Ottoman Empire, though it's the rumors of the previously mentioned strange being, here called Kawa, and the chemistry between the game's various characters that is the primary focus of the adventure. And if you played any other RPG Maker title before, you won't be too surprised by what Felvidek has to offer, as gameplay-wise, its combat, equipment management system, and menus are all stock RPG Maker fare, with little work done to disguise this fact, while the bulk of the game's intrigue and enjoyment comes from the story and dialogue, with the gameplay functioning primarily as a stage upon which to base these more prominent features. This isn't to say that the gameplay is bad, quite the contrary, it's overall quite excellent, just that at this point the traditional JRPG system Felvidek makes use of is of such well-trod territory that it's hardly worth mentioning. Oh shit, that's a new pedantic hotline that I'm testing out. Let's take our first caller, shall we? Hello, Noa Lee, Game Critic Supreme. How may I help you?
Yes, I was wondering how it's possible for a game made in the Czech Republic to be a JRPG when JRPG stands for Japanese role-playing game? That doesn't make any sense.
Go watch IGN or something. I suppose that's about what I expected. Normally this would be a problem, and something that would cause me to lambaste the game for not leveraging the unique aspects of the medium to deliver its message, but Felvidek is smart about how it uses this system as a straightforward framework upon which to tell a story that simply couldn't be told in any other format, or at least not in such a meaningful way. Much like how a D&D campaign works best when the game systems are streamlined enough that they get the hell out of the way and let the players roleplay their fantasy lives rather than worrying about stats and game mechanics, Felvidek uses its sparse gameplay to do the very same. There are no random encounters to slow you down, many fights can be ignored simply by walking around the easily avoidable creatures that roam the land, if they're even present at all, and the game is careful about where and how it incorporates its battles to best underline the rising and falling arcs of tension and release at the heart of the story, to the point that several of these fights can become quite the spectacle despite the underlying combat system not being all that interesting. So while the gameplay elements are rather light, and those present have been used ad nauseum by myriad other games, they're at least being used in a way that reinforces the meaning of the whole experience, rather than functioning as mere filler that stands separate but alongside the narrative and character beats, in stark contrast to how so many other games in the genre tend to balance these two crucial aspects. In this regard, Felvidek is more of a visual novel than a true JRPG, as it stripped away much of the tedium and unnecessary mechanical fluff many indie JRPGs often succumb to in the pursuit of adding more interaction to their gameplay, rarely considering that much of the impetus for playing this kind of game is to experience its story, as the mechanics are usually pretty basic and can get more than a little repetitive and tedious if you aren't careful. And Josef Felvidek seems to understand this, choosing instead to simplify his game's mechanics to the point that only the absolute essentials are left, using the tired and true JRPG equipment and battle systems merely because they fit with the themes at the heart of the story, rather than for the sake of adding in more interaction and filler, as so many of Felvidek's RPG Maker brethren attempt to do. Personally, I wish more JRPGs had the balls to accept this fundamental truth of the genre and remove all but only the essential mechanics necessary to reinforce its themes, story, and character moments that actually matter. I'd probably play a lot more JRPGs if this were the case, as the aspects that turn me off from the genre are the very things that Felvidek has stripped away. I'm not saying random encounters and experience points don't have their place, just that they're so often used in the genre without a second thought as to whether they're even necessary for the game they're a part of, and it's this unwillingness willingness to question the traditional features of the genre that causes most JRPGs, both old and new, to bleed together into fundamentally the same game with a different coat of paint, at least when viewed on a purely mechanical level. And I think that's an important distinction to make as an oft-overlooked reason as to why so many indie developers choose the RPG Maker engine for their games in the first place, as mainstream audiences and reviewers often assume it's merely the lack of technical skills on the part of the developer that's the sole impetus for using the engine, often citing the previously mentioned sameness between RPG Maker titles and JRPGs in general as evidence for their claim. But while that's certainly true in a lot of cases, it's the RPG Maker titles that manage to rise above the rest that are often the very kinds of games that couldn't be presented in any other system without losing a key aspect of what makes them stand out, and amateurish quality is only part of the equation. The aesthetic choice of which engine best serves the project in question makes up the remainder, as does the willingness to pick and choose and at times remove these traditional mechanics to better serve the game's central goals. And that's exactly the case here. Felvidek is the very kind of game that would be lesser had it been presented in any other engine or merely been a visual novel, as the idiosyncrasies and pace provided by the RPG Maker system complement this offbeat historical fiction, as well as the visuals and tone, to such a strong degree that separating the two would only result in disaster. By the way, if you're interested in doing a bit of a deeper dive on how game engines can affect the look and feel of a project as a work of art, check out the game engine section of my Animal Well critique, where I go a bit more in depth on that very topic. Plug, go watch it, it's a good video. And following this line of thinking, Joseph Felvidek clearly wasn't afraid to make some mechanical changes in order to better fit with his vision, as unlike your standard JRPG, or indeed most RPG Maker titles, there are no experience points to be gained, no levels to be reached, or special abilities to unlock. Instead, your stats and abilities are determined by what equipment you've equipped, while health and mana are upgraded through certain consumable items that will permanently increase them. I don't actually remember which ones do what because it's been months now since I played this game, but they're there. Each character in your party, which usually boils down to just Pavel and the cleric Matej, start out with their own special abilities that are tied to their roles, such as Pavel's half-sorting ability that causes enemies to take extra damage for a while, and Matej's ability to bless the party to recover lost HP, but from that point onward, all of the abilities and skills you gain throughout your journey are derived solely from what equipment you happen to be wearing or wielding at the time. For example, equipping daggers will allow you to perform the stab action, which adds a bleed status effect to the recipient, polearms will allow you to sweep and attack all enemies on screen at once, and guns will allow you to fire a bullet to deal massive damage at the cost of having to spend the next turn reloading. Again, none of this is too out of the ordinary for an RPG Maker title, nor is anything here all that unique as far as game mechanics go. All this has clearly been done before, but I do think it's important to note the changes that have been made to the standard system provided by the engine to show that a lot more care and thought went into what mechanics were focused on, rather than simply allowing the engine to dictate it all. Where Felvidek does innovate, however, is in the presentation of these mechanics as well as its overall world. As you've probably noticed by now, the level of spectacle on display during combat is much higher than your average JRPG, both those found in the indie scene and even similar titles from larger companies. Each attack and skill are accompanied by a quick little first-person animation that adds a higher level of polish and personality to the game than many of its contemporaries, while delivering much of its humor and entertainment both in and outside of combat. This is helped by the offbeat but gloriously realized visual design of the game, which has this sort of limited palette stone lithography look to it. Each character portrait, sprite, background image, and level asset looks as though they were taken from prints and advertisements from hundreds of years ago, yet their tone and humor is unmistakably modern day. Add into this the occasional low-poly 3D cutscene that has the tenor and pace of a Buster Keaton flick, some unique level scenery, and some gloriously grotesque ghoulies in which to fight, and Felvidek knocks it out of the park with its visual design, though never at the cost of the story and character interactions. And those aspects are, by far, the game's strongest asset, with each character you come into contact with, no matter how central to or disconnected from the overall plot they may be, ending up as an absolute joy to experience, as well as just being a bunch of well-rounded individuals with their own quirks and mannerisms, their own beliefs and motivations, loyalties, and inner demons. Pavel, for example, is initially portrayed as merely an alcoholic slob who draws the ire of everyone around him, yet even early on he's shown to be be a very capable and thoughtful person, if a bit rash, and one whose honor and duty remains central to everything he does, a far cry from the bumbling fool everyone takes him for. This aspect of his personality is only further reinforced as the game progresses, as we slowly learn that his alcoholism is the result of post-traumatic stress from his experiences on the battlefield and narrowly escaping death multiple times, with alcohol being the only substance that can calm his nerves enough to allow him to function at all, let alone allow him to continue his duties as a knight. Likewise, Matej, the cleric, is initially shown to be a religious zealot preaching the dogma of Catholicism, but like Pavel, is a character with a much greater depth than a first glance would reveal, as he struggles with the task of staying true to his faith and helping others to do the same, despite a deep-seated doubt not only of the Catholic Church, but of the very teachings of Christ himself, while also being keenly aware of the lack of sincerity of his fellow clerics and priests who seem only to use these teachings and the Church's influence to benefit themselves at the expense of the masses. And this is to say nothing of the dialogue with which it's all presented. Josef Pelvelka seems to have a knack for portraying the style and tempo of medieval speech through the use of modern words and phrases. Normally, when this is done, it comes across as forced and more than a little annoying, but here the style is handled with such care that it greatly adds to the charm of the overall project. Combine this with the fact that each character has their own voice, tempo, favorite phrases, and vocabulary, to the point that even though they're all speaking in a similar style, you can easily tell who is speaking even without their character portrait being present on screen, something else that is rarely taken into consideration in a JRPG setting, or most narrative-driven games for that matter. And all this without a single vocal performance, only text to convey these character traits and mannerisms. That is truly impressive. In addition, Felvidek has a small but excellent soundtrack to tie it all together and set the tone for the whole experience. The battle music is catchy, the overworld and dungeon themes are moody and atmospheric, and when combined with the punchy and often goofy sound effects and the aforementioned visual design, Felvidek ends up providing an experience unlike anything else I've ever played. It's a small game with a small amount of assets and ideas that somehow manages to pack a big punch, to the point that I can't help but admire and love it, despite it providing only a visual novel's worth of mechanical interaction. That is quite the accomplishment, because if you know anything about my taste as a critic, you know that gameplay is usually what I care about most, but here the non-gameplay elements are handled so well and are so different from any other game around that they simply can't be ignored. Really, my only complaint with Felvidek is that it falls all too easily into the same trap that many indie JRPGs fall into, in that much of your time, perhaps even most of your time, will be spent simply running around the same handful of areas over and over again, as different days trigger different events that require speaking to the same handful of characters, or you'll be tasked with reporting some piece of information to a character who happens to be on the opposite end of the map, only for you to go racing back to your original location once the task has been completed. This issue is often disguised by the aforementioned filler of random encounters, pointless side quests, and forced NPC interactions, but seeing as Felvidek has stripped all of these away and replaced them with absolutely nothing, it's an issue that is now very noticeable, and it does tarnish a bit of its shine. On the one hand, this isn't that much of a problem, as this world is quite small, and it doesn't take all that much time to walk from one end of the map to the other, less than a minute if you know where you're going, but on the other hand, this only exacerbates the problem, as there's very little scenery to catch the eye and prevent the player from zoning out during each and every jaunt from one point of interaction to the next. And in a game that so heavily relies on its visuals, story, and dialogue to convey its themes, tone, humor, and pace, that certainly isn't ideal. Though I'm not really sure what the solution to this issue would be, other than adding in the very filler and tedium that so many other JRPGs incorporate into their design. I guess given the choice between a few minutes running back and forth between the same 2 or 3 locations, and an hour spent doing the same, but that hour being broken up by random encounters and pointless character interactions, I'd gladly choose the former. I suppose one solution could be to simply skip travel entirely and just transport the characters from one scenario to the next, and to its credit, this is something that the game occasionally does to cut down on the tedium, but it could have been done a hell of a lot more without making too much of an impact on what few gameplay elements and points of interaction remain. Or perhaps even the addition of a conversation system similar to what the Oxenfree games have would be a good replacement for this JRPG filler, especially in a game that relies so heavily on its story and characters to drive the whole full experience such as this. Though that would require a much greater scope than Felvidek clearly had, and would need to be something foundational to the game itself rather than incorporated as an afterthought, else it would only detract from the remainder of the game, so perhaps things are best left as they are. But if Josef Pavelka ever decides to give us a sequel or spiritual successor of some kind, both of these potential solutions should definitely be considered. Ultimately though, there just isn't anything else like Felvidek, and for that very reason, it deserves far more attention than it's currently getting. It's a short and sweet little gem from an indie dev who I'm hoping to see more from one day, while also being the kind of game that doesn't shy away from its roots, nor the eccentricities of both its oddball setting and the game engine used to bring it all to life. A small game with a lot of heart that I thoroughly enjoyed. I'm Noa Lee, god of game criticism, and thus have I spoken.